Why don't we get started? I think it would be nice, as Weiwen suggested, if you all want to take a minute and talk about the etiology of the
Yeah.
training, because I mean, I feel fortunate that I happen to know that you had these skills, and that's just because Chi was working with me. And so when the team started to ask, I was like, wait a second, I think we got something. So I'm gonna mute and turn my video off and let you all get going. So thank you
Thanks,
both.
Barbara.
Thank all three of you very much. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to start out, because we really, got involved in doing this training, say that Jack and I both have done a lot of solution-focused brief therapy training, to practitioners, and a lot in the child and family services is the main group that we've done. Of course, I've done a lot to the mental health practitioners in general and in school settings too. And we kind of cross over that way. And Jack and I, have done solution-focused training all the way back to the 90s together. And he remembered exactly the last time we did a training, that was out in the national audience. And that was like in New Orleans. And I didn't remember that, but he did remember that. So this kind of brought us together to do this. But the way we got involved in this is really because Weiwen, contacted us, and he was supervising the social workers at Ground Zero in China. 200 social workers came to a training then after that, which Weiwen facilitated for us to do this training to the social workers in mainland China. And they were in dire straits. Now, I've done a lot of work in China myself, so I was very helpful to facilitate it with Weiwen because of my presence in China, because I've been there. But really it was Weiwen, that was volunteering his time to supervise these social workers in China. And it was, they were really in great need. They didn't have the kind of training that y'all had. They didn't have Jack Nowicki, that was out there doing these training in agencies and across the state of Texas, or even me that has done, lots of trainings even here in Austin with LifeWorks and so forth. They didn't have any people like that. In fact, we did a survey of them and found that, only about 50% of them had any crisis training at all in China. So Weiwen was on the front lines with them, supervising them, volunteering his time, and he saw the need for this training. And that's how we got involved in doing the training. So, of course, I immediately, when Weiwen contacted me, I thought of Jack, because I knew he had done this crisis training many times out in the youth services. And we combined our efforts and we did this training in the mainland China. And that's how, I guess, it came to the attention of people. It's starting to come to the attention of people, the crisis training. So I'm very happy that we can do this today. And Weiwen, I just wanted you to say something to, about your supervision quickly, to the social workers, in China that are working directly with the COVID-19 there.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Franklin. So yes, I got involved with this project primarily because, I was introduced by my colleagues in Hong Kong that, a lot of social workers are working with the families affected by the virus, and a lot of them were in such a crisis, so much so that, they just can't function anymore. So back then, around 200 social workers formed an online group, and they were doing counseling work through online platforms such as WeChat in China. And a lot of times, those social workers felt that the needs of the community was massive, and it was so massive that they couldn't even handle them in such a big volume. So a lot of the volunteers and social workers are also, we're also experiencing burnout and, acute anxiety because of, the virus and the evolving situation that is going so fast. Well, I feel like the situation right now here in the United States and also other countries is exactly like what we have experienced. Mm-hmm. So I think in response to crisis situation like this, the training that Dr. Franklin and Jack just did to the social workers in China is also much needed here in the United States, and so much more, so many more people are in need of, you know, these information to help them navigate like a stressful situation. So yeah, I'm glad to help. And just like Jack just said again, so we are a team together, and we will just do as much as we can, you know, to help the people here and around the world.
Thank you, Weiwen. You know, and thank you for all your work, you know, and it shows the quality of our doctoral students at UT, you know, and the Steve Hicks School of Social Work. It makes me very proud, you know, to be a part of our faculty. And so, you know, with that introduction, you know, you have our bios there. You know, we worked a lot, you know, in the solution-focused brief therapy. I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and he's going to start out, you know, with the PowerPoint. And we're going to walk through the PowerPoint. If you can stay on there, you can write down your questions on chat. Weiwen will keep track of those as they go along too, if you want to do that. We will have the question and answers at the end, like Barbara suggested. And if you could, you know, just, you know, keep track of those, and you're welcome to write them in on the chat as well. And Weiwen will help, you know, keep track of them. And he's also going to facilitate as we go through. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jack.
Okay. Well, I'm happy that we're all together doing this again, and excited about the opportunity to really pull together from different locations. Last time we did it, we were all in the same room, and so you know, I'm excited to see how this works with us all in different locations. The crisis intervention training that I've been doing, and that's reflected in the handout, is material that we originally developed years ago for the Services to At-Risk program in the state of Texas. And my colleagues and I did that training probably pretty much in that format, although we integrated new research as it came along, probably for 20 years. And the two original sources were Carl Slakehue, who actually used to teach at UT in the psychology department, and his crisis intervention text. And then later on, we also integrated Al Roberts' crisis intervention. And all of that we dovetailed with the treatment solution-focused brief therapy model. So what I'm going to be doing right now is, for probably the first 25 minutes, is a pretty brief and quick overview of the crisis intervention theory as stated by Carl, and then later pretty much repeated by Al Roberts. So we're going to go through that, and then we're going to dovetail into how solution-focused is a very good treatment methodology to use to have conversations with folks who are in crisis. And Weiwen is going to follow us with the PowerPoint. So I'm over on slide 4. Slide, the one before the activity. There you go. So a lot of times with this training, and I just want to ask people who are attending it to think about a crisis that you survived. And it's really important one you survived, not one you're going through right now. And I want you to think about it and remember the first things you began to do to cope with that crisis. So you're thinking about one that's done, it's over, you're now neutral about it, like, you know, breaking up with somebody, having a car wreck, something like that. Could be a big one, could be a small one. What I want you to do is take a few minutes to write down on a piece of paper the things you did to cope right after you experienced that crisis. And you know, specifically the ones that you felt like were best things you could do, and of course the things that are positive. So since we don't have 5 minutes to just sit here, I'm going to go on with this. Jot yourself a little list and put it aside. So now I'm on the theory thing. Okay. Slakehu's definition of a crisis is a temporary state of upset or disorganization characterized by a person's inability to cope using their normal problem-solving methods. There's two types of crisis. One is a situational crisis. It's an accidental or unexpected crisis like a hurricane, a tornado, the coronavirus. And then there's also a developmental crises, and developmental crises are predictable based on transitional situations. And as I was preparing for this morning, I started thinking about how at this point we can look at the COVID-19 as kind of a developmental crisis, because as we're all going through this last 2 or 3 weeks, it seems like whatever crisis we started this with is developing all the time. And so I started thinking this is actually a situational crisis, like when you find out you have a cold and you might have this or whatever. And then also, as you find out it's going to be a week before you can get tested, and it's going to be this before you can get that, that really makes it more of a transitional situation that's going to occur. And if you've been watching the news at all, you see every day that we're still in the transitional stage where they keep saying, well, in 8 days, we'll know really how bad this is, things like that. So there's those two different types of crisis, and both of those have a immediate effect on people. And the effect is, according to Slakehue, disorganization and disequilibrium. Disequilibrium is being thrown off the normal behaviors a person has, such that they're no longer coping. Disorganization has to do with the fact that, you know, we become disorganized, and that can look like, you know, tired, wanting to sleep all the time, feeling helpless, being anxious. I talked to a client yesterday who asked me, she said, I'm feeling more anxious than usual. Is that normal for this kind of a crisis? And people want to know, you know, that, oh yeah, that's pretty normal for what's going on right now. Confused, there's a lot of times physical symptoms. One of the worries with affective crisis is people who are in crisis are more vulnerable to further harm. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, they're also more willing to try something or to do something new to reestablish equilibrium or to begin to cope with it. Let me see if I have anything else down there. Nope. Next slide. Okay, so in assessing crisis, when we're meeting with people or talking to people to assess their crisis, one of the things we want to look at first is how are they coping with it? And one of the rules of this theory of crisis intervention is that before you can resolve a crisis, you have to be coping effectively with it. If a person is not coping effectively with the crisis, then their chance of finding a good resolution is hampered because they weren't coping effectively when they began to work on, you know, resolving it. However, in our experience in working with people in crisis, and I say this is a rule, almost everybody that I've ever met with who's in crisis is not as interested in how they're coping as they are in, I want this solved now. And so they jump ahead to the solution, and yet our job is to help them to reestablish equilibrium or effective coping first. So one of the things we want to do is we want to explore with people how they're presently coping with this crisis. And effective coping, and this is from page 2 in your handout, has much more information about this. But effective coping is searching for information, expressing, hang on, I got ahead of myself. Searching for information, expressing positive and negative feelings, tolerating frustration, looking for help from others, breaking problems down into smaller pieces, being aware of fatigue, pacing efforts, being flexible and willing to change, trusting in oneself and others, and having basic optimism. Now, that does not mean that you have to do all of that to cope effectively. When we are first talking to people, however, we want to keep our, we want to attend to and point out or make a special deal of anything they say that fits any of those characteristics, because that is something they're already doing that can work, okay? So the counselor task in that very beginning is to figure out what coping skills they're already using, what's working to deal with a crisis, what other kinds of things have they tried in the past, and what other kinds of things could they do in the present. One of the things that I do is when I hear something that somebody says that they're doing, like, oh, well, the only way I've been coping with this is to pray. So is that helping? Yes, that helps a lot. And so we want to list those things that help. Other people will say, I've been talking to my sister. It always helps me to talk to my sister. I've heard people say, I started, pardon me, I started exercising. As soon as I knew I was in crisis, I knew I had to get more exercise, things like that. Next slide. So of course, it's really important as social workers or first responders for us to be reducing lethality. This is not a workshop on looking for reducing lethality, but it's always important to listen for clues in your conversations with people about any clue to physical danger, either to the person themselves or to someone else. And of course, since we're talking to a lot of folks from a lot of different agencies right now, the number one rule is you want to follow your agency's protocol or policies for reporting danger to yourself or others. And if you're a social worker, of course, there's ethics that we want to follow. The important thing is when people are in crisis, they will express things that may be signs that they're, thinking about physical danger. And so we really want to either ourselves do a kind of an assessment of the level of danger, or, make sure that we can set that up for them as soon as we can. Crises have two phases. They're acute states, not chronic states. And as I mentioned before, the first phase is restoring equilibrium. That's using effective coping. And that generally, the research isn't great on this, but generally what we teach is that people can generally begin to restore equilibrium within 6 weeks. There's a whole bunch of information about in policy manuals about how much time the state, the feds, other people give people in order to restore equilibrium. And that leads in the direction of how much time people will give people after a crisis. You notice that in the last 2 days, we've heard a lot of procedural and policy information from not only the state government, but the federal government on the kinds of things they're going to do to help people to restore equilibrium. Mm-hmm. And that is all planned to happen in a very short period of time. Restoring equilibrium is basically going back to the pre-crisis status that the person has. So if you have a person that comes into a crisis with, say, alcohol problems, that doesn't mean they're going to resolve their alcohol problems. It does mean they're going to go back to, or restoring equilibrium would be going back to the pre-crisis status of their situation. Then the second phase, of course, is resolving the crisis. And if we know that restoring equilibrium can usually happen within 6 weeks, and as a matter of fact, the policies in the program I used to train for was they gave 60 to 90 days to restore equilibrium, and then 90 days to 6 months to basically resolve the crisis. Now, that wasn't based on really good research, but that's kind of the norm. Resolving the crisis, and this is one of the things I really like about the way Carl Slakey talks about it. Resolving the crisis is basically integrating it into the fabric of your life so that you can look back on it and it's a helpful thing. So, for example, resolving a crisis over a breakup with somebody might be to look back on the parts of the relationship that you enjoyed, the parts of the relationship that you learned from, and the things you'll never do again in the next relationship. Things like that. That's integrating it into your life. Sometimes, especially in these kinds of things like an epidemic, all of our work may be about helping restore coping, even though the person wants the crisis resolved. I know many times, given the kinds of timelines we had in the STAR program, there were multi-problem families, and basically we spent the whole time we worked with the client just restoring equilibrium, and hoping in doing that we were planting a seed that the next time they would give us a call or they'd move on their own. So, next slide. Goals of crisis intervention. As I just said, sometimes the client's goals are, I want this solved tomorrow. Our goals are helping the person use effective coping to restore equilibrium and return to their pre-crisis level of functioning. And then, and what I usually say in my trainings is then, by invitation, if the person wants to continue work towards resolving the crisis, then we go further with it. So our tasks in doing that are to identify their strengths and resources and put them into play to make any changes to restore equilibrium or to move in the direction of resolving the crisis. Slide 10. This slide is actually a pictorial or a graphic kind of example of phase one. Generally, phase one is reestablishing effective coping. Sometimes it's called psychological first aid right in the beginning first responder research calls it psychological first aid. It has to do with explaining limits of confidentiality, helping the person restore equilibrium and coping skills, giving support and encouragement, reducing lethality, and linking to helping resources. One of the things we found in the last week, or whenever we were with Weiwen and working with the Chinese folks, is that some of the problem was really not having helping resources. So the first responders, crisis intervention folks really were the helping resource. And so a lot of times if there are no resources, then you have to do more work to establish and keep the person coping effectively until we or they find the resource they need to go on. So now what I want you to do is I want you to think back to the beginning of this workshop when I asked you to think of the things you did to cope with your crisis. And I'm going to read this list, and as I'm reading the list, or if you want to follow along on page 2 of the handout, I'm going to read this list, and I want you to think about which of these characteristics, the things that you felt were helpful to restore equilibrium, which areas they fit in. So effective coping is actively exploring reality issues and searching for information, expressing both positive and negative feelings and tolerating frustration, actively looking for help from others, breaking problems down into manageable bits and working them through one at a time, being aware of fatigue and tendencies towards disorganization, while pacing efforts and in maintaining control in as many areas as possible, mastering feelings where possible, accepting them when necessary, and being flexible and willing to change, and trusting in yourself and others and having a basic optimism. When you think about what you did to cope, if you are working with somebody who knew about helping you to reestablish equilibrium, they would know that the things that you selected, whether they were positive or negative, and if they were positive, what they would do is they'd say, oh, how did that work? Was that a good thing? Was that helpful? Are you still doing that? How could you have done, you know, how did you make that happen? Questions like that. So one of the first things we do is try to find out what they're already doing. And then we want to build on that by reinforcing it, by asking questions about it, stuff like that. Under the counseling section here, it basically says, determine what skills they're using. Wait a minute, you went backwards on it. Put me, thank you. Okay, thanks. Once we get what they're doing, then we really want to accentuate that. That's the real key. Now, the next slide is phase 2 is short-term counseling that extends beyond coping to the person resolving the crisis. In the case of responding to the coronavirus or COVID-19, restoration of coping might be understood as the time when the person finds out that they're not infected, or that they are received into the hospital or a treatment setting, or that some of their medical kind of treatment, or that they've successfully survived this illness. Phase 2 might be helping them integrate that into their lives afterwards. So in phase 2, if we were still around working with the people in phase 2, it's adjusting to whatever happened that moved them from restoring equilibrium into the next phase. What we teach is that restoring equilibrium, resolving the crisis can take 60 to 90 days, months, or up to years. A lot of the integration of crises has to do with the cultural and philosophic belief system of the person. So that, you know, in certain cultures, it is understood that it's going to take a certain amount of time to resolve, say, a death in the family, or resolve a serious loss. So a lot of that has to do with us fitting our interventions into what the belief system of the person is. Okay, next slide. This protocol for a crisis session is a slide that we have in here, and it's a part of the handout. Anyway, it's a page in the handout that if you have the opportunity, it's on page 5 of the handout. If you have the opportunity to work with people in a more sit down, face to face, whether or not it's online or in vivo, it has to do with a protocol for doing a complete session or a counseling session with a client or clients or family that's in crisis. Rather than go over this, I'm just referring you to page 5. It's actually a chapter that LaShawn Arbuckle over at LifeWorks and I wrote back in 2009. When a colleague of ours named Dr. Franklin was one of the editors of that edition, and encouraged us to write it. And it had to do with using crisis intervention as well as solution-focused brief therapy to work with people in crisis. So the last thing I want to say is on the next thing, Weiwen. Basically, and this is a segue into Dr. Franklin's material, we think of solution-focused brief therapy as a constructivist, language-based intervention. And within that kind of a definition, how we have conversations with people and how we ask questions really determines how people answer the questions. And the direction of our question influences the person's focus on possibilities and solutions. So in reestablishing effective coping, one of the things that I've seen is that when people are in crisis, they forget that they have resources. And so we don't want to remind them, oh yeah, you have resources. However, we want to have conversations with them where our questioning brings out or helps remind them of the things they've done in the past that are helpful. And so, you know, so how we ask questions is very important. Some of the examples I have on this slide are, you know, and rather than saying, what's the problem? We might say, so what is your best hope for our meeting today? Because we want to move right into the direction that it needs to go to be helpful for the person. What are the things that are not impacted by the crisis? This is a great thing to explore with people that are in crisis. When they're in crisis, they think their whole life is impacted by the crisis. There's almost always things that are not impacted by the crisis. One of the things that my brother-in-law said in the last week, and they're visiting here from London, he said, one of the nice things about about having to, be housebound right now is I'm getting a chance to watch a bunch of TV that I never get to see. So, the things to continue are important things that are not impacted by the crisis. So we always want to explore what those are. We always want to explore what has the client done or what has the person done that has worked in the past. What do they want to be different? And then how will they know that things have improved? So Dr. Franklin, you want to start?
Absolutely. Switch the slide, Weiwen, because we're going to be moving into, really how to ask some questions now, solution-focused questions, and how to walk through some steps of solution-focused brief therapy that can help with people in a crisis. And to just summarize what, Jack said that's really important to what I'm going to be saying is he talked about how you have to stabilize people. He talked about how people in a crisis don't have a lot of feeling of hope. They don't really see their way out of the immediate problems that they're in. And I like to call the situation that they're in perpetual problems, because they're not problems that are going to go along, go away right away. They're going to be with them for a while. And so they feel stuck in that. So a part of the message that we have to get across to them then is, and that we have to think about as social workers is that they're in a marathon and not a sprint toward a solution. And so I like that metaphor of marathon and not a sprint toward a solution, because like Jack said, they want to be in the sprint toward the solution. So it's important to think about the types of questions that we ask in solution-focused brief therapy in relationship to crisis. One of the things that I've done in my work is to talk to people about how you actually sequence a session of solution-focused brief therapy, how and why and when you ask the questions, and what are the purpose of those questions in a change process. And so we want to look at that a little bit in relationship to crisis. And there's basically 3 different types of questions that we ask in solution-focused brief therapy. One of them is validation and joining kinds of formulations and questions that we do. This is things that you're all familiar with, like empathy, reflective listening, compliments about self and skills, and so forth. We also ask change and difference questions, such as exception questions, goal clarification, and so forth. And then the third types of questions we ask are acceptance and coping questions, which Jack has been emphasizing, a relationship to the crisis that has to do really with helping people cope and normalizing their experiences. So when we're in a crisis, you have to begin where the client is by focusing on the validation and coping questions and not moving quickly to change questions. That's what Jack's been talking about. So timing of the different formulations and questions becomes very important to change in solution-focused brief therapy. What we really think about is like we're on a teeter-totter. And what we're trying to do with clients is we're trying to both stabilize the client and help the client change at the same time. And that's a balancing act for effective therapy. Let me say that again. You have to help clients stabilize, and you also help them change at the same time. And you have to work with the client to figure out, exactly how much stabilization they need in relationship to change. And you change that. One of the things I've also written about is how to work with emotion in solution-focused brief therapy. Now, Eve Lipchick also wrote a book on that, called Beyond Technique and Solution-Focused Brief Therapy, but I've worked with it in relationship to some of my colleagues because it's something that's implicit to the model, but not often written about. And so when we think about how to deal with crisis, we're dealing with emotions of people, and high emotions of people, anxiety, stress, people that are that are distressed, or they're having depression. Maybe people are being triggered because they're already have been traumatized and this is re-traumatizing them. We're dealing with those types of reactions of clients. So it's important to think about, how do we work with emotions in solution-focused brief therapy? So the way that solution-focused brief therapy works with emotions is we basically translate emotions into behaviors. And we also ask about thoughts, and emotions in relationship to thinking and what would make a person feel better. What I would like to get across to you today is why we're doing that. It's because we're trying to transform someone's experience from a negative emotional experience to a more positive emotional experience. And there's a reason for that. It's just like, in the research of the positive psychology, they told us the reason why that is. Because when people are able to enact positive emotions like that, they're able to think more clearly and problem solve better. And that's why we do that. That's the reason why. So we elicit positive emotions. And so that's telling people what to attend to, asking them to attend to emotions in a different way than they're attending to the emotions at the time of the crisis. And that's what we do. I'll give you an example. I was working with a client who had been emotionally abused. This is a young woman, by her boyfriend. And we were trying to get her into some different kinds of housing. And right when I was working with that client at that time, she actually, got a FaceTime from her boyfriend, who was basically saying, pick up the phone. Well, when she looked at that, she was totally hypnotized by that experience. It was totally triggering to that client. She looked at that right at the moment, at the time, because he was saying, pick it up. And by the way, this is like what Billie Eilish says, a bad guy, make your mom sad guy. This is a bad guy that she's dealing with. So what I did, to get her back is I said to her, look at me, look at around here at what we're doing. Look at me. You're, helping the person attend to their emotions in a different way by doing that. Now in the trauma literature, they sometimes call that grounding, but we do the same thing in solution-focused brief therapy. That was very important in Zuckerberg, to be able to focus the attention of the client, in a certain sort of way. And that's a therapeutic strategy. Go ahead, Weiwen, next slide. This is some examples of how we work with emotions, and we won't look at all those questions, but let's look at the first two here. So when you were less angry at your job, what will be happening with you? So this is how you focus emotion onto behavior, and this changes the experience then of client. Second question, what do you imagine things will be like at their worst? Or alternative, have you hit rock bottom yet? We're asking the client to shift their thinking then about, their experience, a relationship to the crisis. And you can look at these other questions on your own. But these are purposeful questions that are asked on purpose to get people to shift thinking, behavior, and experience, in the process of a therapeutic change. Go ahead, Weiwen. So here's some other questions that we can ask about following the client. When I'm not going to go through all these questions because we don't have time today, but basically these are questions that you can do to follow your client in the crisis situation. What tells you that? Tell me more about that. If we had more time, when I do training or workshops, is I'll help people sort those questions into whether they're validating, whether they have to do with change and difference, or whether they, have to do with coping types of strategies or normalization or acceptance of the client. And then you begin to see then how to work with the questions in that balancing of the stabilization of the client and also helping the client to change. This is the focusing on strengths and abilities. And this is a great a way to really move people, from difficulties, moving a solution into their difficulties. We talk about present and future in this. The focus during the meetings is always on the person's strengths and resources. Now, that doesn't mean, I hope that you're getting from our talk today, that we don't listen and validate the client a lot in a crisis or when they're going through a trauma, because you have to do that. And as we've been emphasizing, that's the main part of what we do when we're working with people in the crisis intervention. These next slides really have to do with some basic steps that we can follow, using the solution-focused brief therapy. And one of these is like specifying the problems and, and breaking them down into manageable pieces is one of the most important things that we can do. We can do this just by listening to clients. So if we listen to what they say, we can say things like, so this is important to you. So this is important to you. So that's helping them then break down the problem. We can say, so what would be most helpful to you? We can identify coping strategies too. Make a list of the coping strategies. What have you done so far is a question that we can ask there. What have you done so far and how was that helpful? So you're getting people then to tell you about, what they've done and whether it was helpful or not. Just a strategy here too. Sometimes when you ask clients that, they have a very difficult time coming up with something. You have to be patient with it, but if they don't come up with something, that's when you switch to something like the miracle question or switch to something else, because it gets them outside the stuck thinking. It gives them another way to think about their coping. So it's really important to listen to the clients for what they've done so far and ask them the question, how was that helpful to you? Go ahead, Weiwen. So this slide has exploring exceptions and creating, preferred futures. When we're in a counseling session with solution-focused brief therapy, like I told you, my colleague and I have looked at how to sequence this therapy, how to start, how to ask the questions, how to move, between the questions to get a change. But we always start with the preferred future because that's the goal. And that's where you start with solution-focused brief therapy. You start with a goal. It's so you can start with what does the person want to happen. You can even, say something like in our chat today, what if it was helpful to you, if when I was talking to you, what would need to happen? Or what would you need to find out? You can ask something very specific about the client. You can say, if after we chat today, your worries about your children were improved, what would have to happen? So you can start right there with the preferred future with a client. Exceptions questions are also important. Now, those are change questions, but they can be very important also for emphasizing instances in life when things, even though, that you have some negative current circumstances, a little bit of something is going better. And that's the way you would want to use the exception question, in a crisis. So the thing I'll say about exceptions too is that they're very good questions for people that have depression and anxiety. Think about people that are having depression and anxiety that are under a lot of emotional distress. This affects their amygdala. It causes people to worry and ruminate. It causes fear and panic in people. And when they're anxious like that, they can't think right. They have tunnel vision. The exception question helps them to focus their experience differently again. It helps them to focus their thinking differently and away from that type of ruminating, rehearsing the problem, kind of thinking. And we want to snap them out of that. And so that's why we can use the exception question in a crisis in that way. And it helps with people with depression and anxiety. Now in the research, and I should tell you, there's over 150 RCTs, random clinical trials, on solution-focused brief therapy now. And one of the things we know in the research across countries and across different types of settings is it's a very helpful intervention with internalizing disorders like depression and anxiety. So that's why we can use the questions too, like this in a crisis. An example of an exception question that you might ask, to someone, and I'm just hypothetically here, but you're very worried about giving your children the virus. Tell me sometimes when you worry less and enjoy your children. That would be an example of a question. Another example, you feel alone. You want to make contact with your relatives, but you're very worried, about infecting them. What are some times you have contacted them, in a safe way, or, thought about contacting them? These would be examples of like exception questions that you could use in a crisis situation. When scaling is something that all social workers are familiar with. It's used in different types of therapies. It's used in behavior therapy. It's used in motivational interviewing. It's used in solution-focused therapy. The way we use it in solution-focused therapy, again, is to anchor the person's experience. And we often ask them to think about what's the next step on the scale. And y'all are all familiar with that way of using it. But the coping question can also be used as a scale. So when we're eliciting strengths and coping resources of clients, you can use a coping question to do that too, by finding out how well they're coping. And real important to that situation and finding out how well they're coping is when you get the coping score, no matter what it is, then you want to compliment the client and reinforce their coping experience that they have. So if they tell you it's a 3, you want to compliment them and you want to say something like, 3, that's pretty good given your circumstance. So use the validation questions again, the support questions. You say, that's really good. I'm amazed that you were able to even have a 3. I mean, everything you're going through right now, all the stress that you're going through with your children, all the stress of having to stay home, being laid off from your job, all the things you're having, it's amazing you're 3. How did you do that? How did you manage that? So again, you reinforce their experience. You get them to talk about their coping then. And that's even when you can generate that list of coping that Jack was talking about, because they'll tell you things about the coping in that. And then we can also ask them, how could you move up a half point then? How could you improve your coping from a 3 to 4? Even if it's just a little bit, the coping. We can just move up just a tiny bit. How would we do that? And it gives a person a chance then to think about what they're doing well and what they might do more of, and something new too that they might be able to do to help themselves. Go ahead, Weiwen. Let's see. Okay, setting goals. That's really important. And the main thing I want to say about the setting goals is that people that are in a crisis can't think of anything long range. and so you're going to have to think about very small steps. You notice even in the Corona reports, things change hourly. If you follow all this, I mean, I get those updates from Dell, the COVID-19 updates, and things are just changing, all the time, in that. And so that's the person's experience too. That's like their experience. So it's very important in the stabilization when you're setting a goal then to think of some very small steps that people can do. And always important in stabilizing people are, giving them more confidence that they'll be able to solve their problems for the future, is to always help them take a step that they can be successful at. That is very important. So you work with the client to try to think of these small steps. I work with Garza High School, and that's what we do with these kids. That's how we transform them. In many ways, we teach teachers this and other people that, that you take these very small steps, you help them see, how they can, move forward one step at a time. In this case, is their academics, it might be their psychological distress, it might be their family problems, but, we're doing that so they feel more stabilized and they gain confidence over time, step by step by step by step like that. Of course, it's always important to compliment clients. And that question I've said before about how did you do that, that is really important, and really working with clients, that are in a crisis, just listening to them, listening to how they cope, listening to how they're dealing with it, and then finding ways to pull out their strengths and pull out their coping with that. And that helps you set goals as well. Amen. As far as intervention strategies go, this really, is going to come from the client. The solutions, we follow the clients, listen to them, and we build and develop the solutions. And so we might listen for things that they would say, such as, it helps me to wake up and see my children are still well. We listen for things like that. I feel less stressed when I eat. I feel I can cope better when I chat, with my relatives. It helps that school gave us some resources, to help teach my children at home, or, that we can pick up lunches, at the school. So these sorts of things we listen to with the clients. Go ahead, Weiwen. These are some examples of goals and task questions that you might ask to your clients that are in a crisis. How would you do more of this week? You might break it down even further and say, how would you do more of this today? You know, can I check back in with you tomorrow? You know, when I have very small scale things, what would happen if you did this? What would other people do? How might it help? You're already doing this. That points out, you know, strength, and that, you know, that she likes, in this case with the person. What if you started doing this too? What would make a difference? You have a big goal. What would be a small step toward making the goal a reality? All of these things, these kind of questions. What do you think a small step you could take? In this case, this is a teacher would notice, because I work with kids in schools, but you can put in your own type of, you know, question that you could ask a client. And then solution-focused tasks. It's really important for the social worker or anybody that's in a helping role, when you're looking at solution-focused tasks, to ask the person, what do you need right now? What do you need right now? You know, to offer a resource, you know, and help, you know, that they've not tried, you know, that might be helpful to them. And of course, refer the person and follow up. And that's what Jack was also talking about in relationship to the crisis intervention framework that he was presenting. So what do you need? What do you need? What do you need right now? That helps stabilize the client. You know, they can tell you then what they need right now. They may just need you to listen to them and hear them out, but you're giving them that opportunity. Weiwen. There's a couple of resources I put on here for you. You know, I also have that article on emotion, how to work with emotion. If you want that, I didn't put that on here, but you could contact me about that. But this is an article we did to help you understand the change process of solution-focused brief therapy, and really how you know it works. And so you may look at this if you want to see the research on it and want to see how it works more and how you can learn more about it. And Weiwen, go ahead with the next one. And this is a book that we actually put together that has a bunch of resources. And I'll mention one of the resources, the Solution-Focused Brief Therapy Association, because they do have a treatment manual for how to do solution-focused brief therapy that I worked on and other researchers around the world. And you can also learn more about solution-focused brief therapy tools, you know, by going to sfbta.org.